Good morning. It's Monday, January 27th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 479 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Lots of news out of the Middle East today. Israel has just arrested two IDF reservists, one of whom served in an Iron Dome unit on suspicion of spying for the Islamic Republic of Iran. Meantime, the Israeli government is warning certain hostage families of potential bad news concerning their loved ones as the hostage releases continue. I fear some terrible news for the Bibas family in particular. But here's what intrigues me today. Donald Trump shattered a bunch of norms yesterday. Of course, that's no surprise for the US president, who has never quite fit the mold, to put it mildly. This time, however, he's challenging an historic red line in the Middle East. He's pushing both Jordan and Egypt to accept the civilians of Gaza on a temporary basis to allow for Israel to finally clean out the terror-infested coastal enclave once and for all. Not surprisingly, the governments of both countries chafed at the very notion. Enabling the departure of Palestinians from land they deem part of their national project is traitorous in the eyes of the Arab world. But Trump is onto something here. There is no stability for the Middle East so long as Iran's proxies are able to bounce back from wars like the one currently raging in Gaza. Without Palestinians or Israeli hostages on the ground to worry about, the path is clear for Israel and Tehran's terrorist pawns to finish what was started on October 7th. After 15 months of fighting, that sounds pretty good to me. Today's guest is Gidi Grinstein. He is an Israeli entrepreneur and the founder and president of two remarkable organizations, the Reut Group and Tikkun Olam makers. The former is a think tank focused on identifying strategic and policy blind spots within Israel and the Jewish world. Reut works to provide solutions to address those gaps. Gidi's other shop leverages technology and creativity to improve the lives of vulnerable populations worldwide, from those with disabilities to the elderly. Gidi has been doing a lot of work on Gaza lately. We're going to have a conversation with him in just a few short minutes. The ceasefire in Lebanon will now extend until February 18th, the United States confirmed yesterday. The original 60-day ceasefire was set to expire yesterday, but the Lebanese armed forces have failed to control southern Lebanon, or any part of Lebanon for that matter. That's the bad news. The good news is that the government of Lebanon is still allowing Israel to remain deployed until something can be done about Hezbollah. Everyone seems to understand that we cannot allow Iran's most powerful proxy in the Middle East the time and space it needs to get up off its back after getting shellacked by Israel. A resurgent Hezbollah isn't good for anyone, least of all the Lebanese people. But let's be real. The likelihood of the Lebanese military getting its act together is abysmally low. Heck, the Times of London yesterday reported that the head of the Lebanese military leaked sensitive secrets to Hezbollah. And get this, he leaked it from a control room run by the US, France, and the UN. Whatever hope we might have for a soft landing in Lebanon is rapidly evaporating. And if the Israelis can't hand security over to a competent player on the Lebanese side that is not backed by Iran, we may be heading to more clashes. I sincerely hope we aren't. But for now, I'm just glad to see that the White House lifted the previous administration's ban on those MK-47s, those 2,000-pound bombs. Those will come in handy if Hezbollah returns to the battlefield. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, the United Nations suspended its activity in all Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. Why? Because the Houthis have a thing for taking UN staff hostage. Last Thursday, the Iran-backed rebels nabbed 7 UN staffers in the Yemeni capital of Sana'a. That prompted UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to suspend all official movements into and within Houthi-held areas. The UN is now trying to work with the Houthis to secure the release of its employees. And it's not just this crew of 7. The Houthis are actually reportedly holding more than 20 others hostage in Yemen. The count stood at 16 before Thursday, including 11 Yemeni UN staffers the Houthis detained last summer. The hostages are affiliated with a range of agencies, including the UN Human Rights Council, UNICEF, and the World Food Program. Talk about biting the hand that feeds. The UN has done nothing but normalize Iran and its terror proxies for 15 months. Headline 2, Syria's new leaders said they intercepted weapons en route to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Well, that's refreshing. According to Syrian state media, authorities seized the shipment of weapons moving along a smuggling route in the Syrian countryside near the Lebanese border. The weapons reportedly included assault rifles, RPG launchers, and ammo. This isn't a first. Earlier this month, Syria authorities seized rifles, Iranian-made drones, and other weapons making their way to Lebanon. So far, it would seem that Syria's new leaders are holding to their word. They said they'd choke off Iran's traditional smuggling routes to Hezbollah. So far, so good, but they'll have to do more than intercept a handful of weapons caches to earn Western trust, not to mention mine. Headline 3, Qatari Prime Minister Mohammed Al Thani appeared on Israeli Channel 12 yesterday. It was an exclusive, and it was a first for a Qatari prime minister. But apart from that, there was really nothing particularly noteworthy. If anything, I think we can say that the prime minister was on message for one of Hamas's top patrons. Hamas is in a hurry to broker phase 2 of this ceasefire deal, which would effectively end the war and enable Hamas to survive long term. Until this weekend, Hamas had failed to disclose a list of hostages that it would release, including how many of them are alive or dead. Israel was not having any of it. As of yesterday, Hamas is finally holding up its end of the deal, and it even appears that there will be an unplanned release of Arbel Yehud, Agam Berger, and one other unnamed hostage on Thursday. If you ask me, Hamas and Qatar are trying to do everything they can to ensure continued Hamas control over the Gaza Strip, with the full knowledge that Donald Trump is ready to let Israel loose on Hamas if the group doesn't comply. But in the meantime, Israel has just vacated the Netzarim corridor and allowed for Egyptian and U.S. contractors to take over the security arrangements there. A big risk for Israel, if you ask me. The northern Gaza Strip could rather easily be overtaken by Hamas again if these new security forces are not on top of their game. And now, let's get to that interview with Gidi Grinstein. As I mentioned earlier, he's the founder of 2 organizations designed to elevate Israeli society, improve the well-being of vulnerable populations worldwide, and more. I'm excited to hear about what he's been working on recently. It deals with Gaza, and it could, hopefully, maybe, somehow, bring some much-needed optimism to this show. So let's hear from Gidi right now on the FDD Morning Brief. Welcome to the program, Gidi Grinstein.
Jonathan, thank you very much for having me.
All right. Well, Gidi, great to have you on the show. First, if you would, for just a few seconds, just tell us a little bit about the 2 organizations you run.
So basically, the Reut group is a think tank that is based on a methodology. As you know, most think tanks are based on platforms for experts, professors, former diplomats, generals, etc., who bring their knowledge forward and their analysis. Reut is unique in the sense that it was based on a methodology that specializes in identifying disruptions, strategic surprises, and opportunities, which is a topic that is super relevant to understanding October 7 and also, for example, the 1973 war, September 11, the German bypass on France in 1940. These are historical events that emerge because of these kind of strategic surprises that we specialized in. Prior to that, I was the secretary of the Israeli delegation for the negotiations with the PLO under Prime Minister Barak, including at the Camp David negotiations, which is where I have my kind of foundation on the Palestinian issue, which has always been part of my focus in back channels, track 2, and also a book I published a month before the war called Insights, Peacemaking in the Oslo Process, 30 Years and Counting. Jonathan, you would appreciate the timing, publishing a book about peace a month before the war. Perfect. Anyhow, the other project is called TOM, Tikkun Olam Makers, which is a platform for driving innovation around needs of people at the bottom economic ladder, people with disabilities, elderly and poor people who are structurally excluded from the innovation economy. You know, one of the maxims in this field is that 90% of innovation serves 10% of the population. So we're dealing with the bottom 10% of the population, and we want to do it as a global humanitarian Jewish Israeli activity. So basically, we are a platform for humanitarian diplomacy. We've operated in 35 countries, in all Abraham Accords countries, and in the Palestinian Authority, including during the war. And I'm very proud of that balance between impact and diplomacy.
Okay, nice and succinct, and it sounds like 2 really important organizations. So now tell us a little bit about the diplomatic back channeling that you've been doing since the war began.
So basically, as I mentioned, my book was published September 6. It was ahead of September 13, 2023, which marked 30 years to the Oslo Accord. September 15 marked 3 years to the Trump plan of 2020, and September 17 was 45 years to the Camp David Accords of 1978. So it's all crammed in 1 week, what I call the Peace Week. I published my book before together with my co-author, Professor Arya Filala of Rutgers University. We did a bunch of events. Then came the Jewish holidays. We took a break, planned to come back after Simchat Torah, after October 7. And of course, everything was disrupted. And I thought the whole issue and topic was off the agenda. But then the Americans began to think about, and anybody that has some strategic sense started speaking about the day after. What's the political horizon? What is the goal of the war? So beginning from December all the way to March, I was kind of brought into these discussions about what could be an upgraded Arab peace initiative, Saudi peace initiative, a Biden plan, etc. But eventually the American side decided to focus on the Saudi plan, in which the Palestinian component is very narrow, and also to begin to push for a hostage prisoner ceasefire deal in Gaza. This is basically what was their focus, which rendered my work a little bit less relevant. But in July and August, I understood again that sadly, that at least on the Israeli side, there was really a resistance to get to the deal, and that the deal was expanding to include a political process beyond the hostage prisoner exchange. So again, I went back to work, shuttling, meeting mainly people from across the region. I live in New York. A lot of them come to New York around the UN General Assembly, so it makes it easy to meet a lot of people in one place. And slowly crystallizing what turned out to be 13 principles for what is the zone of possible agreement that connects the day after with the political horizon, the economic side with the political side, the Israeli-Palestinian situation, with the UAE-led international force, and potentially also with normalization with Saudi. So all these things brought together in one set of principles that I hope is coherent and consistent.
Let me jump in for a second. First of all, I want to say that I think, celebrating Peace Week, as you call it, could be a new thing for the Middle East. I actually like this idea of like 1 week in September.
We can do it together.
Yeah, I mean, marking them all one day after the next for a week sounds actually, potentially something important for the region to mark.
There's a lot of lessons to be learned.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But just even marking that is kind of interesting. It would be at least shedding some light on some positive things for a change out of the region. But all right, so let's get into that ceasefire plan. I want to hear a little bit more about it. And I know that you say your plan is not inconsistent with the Trump plan, but here's my question, and please answer this while you think about all the other stuff. But, do you think that there is a Trump plan right now? I mean, I don't see any of those old Abraham Accords or peace through prosperity folks back in the White House. So I guess I'm curious, is that still a thing? And how does that factor into?
Well, it's really Well, it is a thing in the sense that it exists. It was published. Everybody can read it. President Trump stood behind it. Netanyahu called it the deal of the century. And it is based on the fundamental principle of two nation states for two people, which is explicitly mentioned in that plan. It also has a number of very good ideas. I think the Palestinians made a big mistake by rejecting it out of hands, and Palestinian leaders that I speak to now say that it was a very big mistake on their part. They should have said, you know what? Very interesting ideas. Let's begin to negotiate, and then basically improve their situation in the plan. We have to understand that this plan, for example, offers the future Palestinian state based on the principle of two nation states for two people, the equivalent of 86% of the West Bank and the entire Gaza Strip. It speaks about Gaza and the West Bank as a single territorial and political unit. It speaks about a Palestinian capital in the area of Jerusalem. It speaks about the resolution of the refugee problem within the Palestinian state. Of course, it guarantees Israel the security needs. And by the way, it assumes as a working assumption that Hamas is being removed from Gaza. So this is a very interesting plan that sadly was dismissed. And I've been consistent since it was published that this is a plan that deserved much more serious attention by people who believe in the peace process than it got. And it is a platform, unlike President Biden, who never presented the plan. President Bush presented the plan. President Clinton presented the Clinton ideas. So we have 3 American presidents actually put forward some sort of a vision, and 2 that didn't, which is Obama and Biden. So we do have that as a reference point. I'm not saying that this is the end point, but it is a reference point. Second is that, and obviously I think we have seen that this administration is really it's important for them to take credit for what they have achieved. They have done the Abraham Accords. They published this plan, and I think also moving forward, they will want to show that it was their work that brought the progress. I want to move to the other end of the spectrum. I believe that this administration can do 5 major deals across the Middle East within a relatively short period of time: in Gaza, in Saudi, in Lebanon, the border with Lebanon, not the peace treaty, but the border with Lebanon, expanding the Abraham Accords also to countries like Indonesia. And there is also in the cards an agreement with Iran that prevents war but also achieves American interests. So there's 5 major deals that could be made, and they are all interconnected in one way or another, which leads me to Gaza. My idea was to connect the local with the regional. One of the key changes in the last year, 2 years, is the regionalization of the conflict. We know that a major reason why Hamas went to war was the potential Israel, US, Saudi deal that was going to be formed in the fall of 2023. Part of the timing of the attack of Hamas, of course, it's not the only reason, was the threat that such a deal would come in and the Palestinian issue would be further marginalized after the Abraham Accords. So we're seeing this context, the regional context, being more and more pronounced. Look at the negotiations happening in Doha with Qatar and Egypt and the US and Israel and the Palestinian side, Hamas, and also Fatah participating marginally, sadly, in my view. So we're seeing the regionalization, and I thought that connecting the regional with the local was essential. I also think that the Trump plan of 2020 will turn out to be a very important benchmark for thinking about permanent status.
Interesting. I mean, I will say that all of the potential deals that you see in the works strike me as potentially positive. Making one with Iran strikes me as less positive right now. I don't trust this regime, and I would expect them to try to break any deal that we might strike with them. And I think there's a real danger for that. But I want to note that you think, I was reading, what you had sent me before the show, and you think that the first phase of the ideas that you've laid out could take 5 years. Realistically, how much do you think can be accomplished in 5 years if right now Hamas is still in control of the Gaza Strip?
Oh, well, I think you're bringing together 2 topics. The first is, what is our vision for the end game in Gaza? And in this case, I believe that the only alternative to Hamas is an upgraded, reformed, there are all these adjectives, Palestinian Authority. Without the introduction of Palestinian security forces into Gaza, it's either Israel direct civil administration in Gaza or Hamas stays in power. Sadly, the government of Israel did not develop an alternative to Hamas, which is why we saw 2 weeks ago an effective collapse of the line of the government of Israel on a number of key points. Number 1, the handing over of humanitarian aid to Hamas in Gaza. Number 2, releasing prisoners from many different Palestinian organizations to Hamas, meaning Hamas released not just prisoners of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, also Fatah prisoners and non-aligned prisoners, and the Democratic Front and the Popular Front. Hamas took over the prisoner issue. Major setback for Israel. Third, Hamas is able to move into the areas that Israel is withdrawing. And even in the northern Gaza Strip, where Israel had control, we're not handing this control to security forces of the Palestinian Authority. Meaning, in the lack of an alternative, we saw a collapse of the Israeli line on all of these issues when we came to sign this prisoner hostage exchange and ceasefire deal. My question moving forward is, what would be different? Let's say we renew the war. Why would the next phase of the war end in any different manner than what we saw right now after 15 months? And the answer is, most likely it will not. So if the Trump administration is in the mindset of deal making, then there will have to be an organized transition from Hamas to the Palestinian Authority. So I want to go into this idea of transition period, which is also connected to the idea of dividing Gaza into 2 areas, Area A and Area B, which is the regime that exists in the West Bank. So regarding Area A and Area B, my suggestion is that Gaza will be 80% Area A, meaning fully controlled by the Palestinian side. I'll explain that in a moment. And about 20% Area B, which is primarily the perimeter. I've been speaking about this for months and months since the summer. And perhaps, that led to the idea that the perimeter is Israeli control 700 meters to 1,100 meters from the border, which is eventually can be defined as Area B, like in the West Bank, meaning full Israeli security control and Palestinian civilian control. The point is that in Gaza, there are no civilians in that space, meaning it's an Area B with full Israeli security control for the transition period. Area A is controlled by the Palestinians, both civil and security. Now, the categorization into Area A and B then allows you to bring in the entire body of agreements, the legal framework that exists in the West Bank. Today in Gaza, there is a legal void. There is no legal framework at all. And that is also essential for the introduction of the international force, because even an international force being introduced, they will need a mandate. The mandate rides on a legal system that has to be in place. And that's how you actually bridge all these things together. Now, why 4 years? Because of the overlap to the Trump administration, number one. Number two, if you speak to the Emiratis, they're saying that whatever international force they get involved in, it's a time-limited involvement. So they want to see a deadline beyond which they can withdraw. Initially, if you spoke to them, you would have heard the numbers 1 year or 2 years. And I said to them, 1 year? In 1 year, you're not even knowing, where is right and where is left in Gaza, especially with everything destroyed. 4 years begins to be a reasonable period of time to be present on the ground. It also, the fact that the international force may withdraw after 4 years creates pressure on the Israeli and Palestinian side to get to some sort of a deal on permanent status. Now, I'm not saying Palestinian statehood right now, because I think we're ways from that outcome. But that 4-year period is a reasonable period for transitioning from the current chaos, economic and security chaos, to some sort of a stable environment in Gaza. There are obviously other elements in the plan, but we can only speak about a handful of them.
Okay. All right. Well, you've laid it out. I have to say, a lot of this does seem like it's, putting the cart before the horse. I think the defeat of Hamas, the defeat of Iran is going to be crucial for any of this to take place. And I think that right now, all of that seems up in the air to me. But I'm going to continue to track your work.
About that.
Yeah.
And just say something about that. What we've seen in the last few days is that, of course, in order to be a strategic threat on Israel, Hamas needs rockets, they need tunnels, they need very significant strategic capabilities. But in order to terrorize Gaza, they need AK-47s, they need guns, they need people in uniform. Meaning, Israel has done quite a significant job at eliminating the strategic capabilities of Hamas. But at the end of the day, if you don't introduce an alternative security force, you will be left with people in Hamas wearing uniforms, waving around AK-47s and terrorizing the population, creating the image as if they control the ground. And even if Israel, just look at the number of Israeli casualties that are required to clean up a small area in northern Gaza. We're talking about more than 30 casualties in 3 weeks in a small area in northern Gaza. So multiply that across Gaza, 2 million, and this is an area that has been evacuated. Multiply that across entire Gaza, 2 million people, and then staying in control over that area. This could be the most draining operation that the IDF has ever had. And we're seeing the cost of kind of moving into this muddling through situation in Gaza. So without an alternative to Hamas, without creating an alternative to Hamas, I don't think there will be a replacement for the presence of Hamas in Gaza. And that is the working assumption. That is the working assumption of the plan.
Right. But of
I'm
course,
I'm very transparent about that.
Yeah. But of course, that might include the resurrection of the Palestinian Authority in the Gaza Strip. And of course, we know now that the PA has been spending a huge amount of money, millions of dollars on pay for slay, calling and congratulating some of the terrorists that have been released. Not easy things to solve. I'm glad you're thinking about them. I'm glad I'm not right now. I'm still thinking about Israel's military victories. But we're glad that you've joined us today, Gidi Grinstein, on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you very much for having me.
Here's what we've got on tap for you today. My colleague Bill Roggio has a new piece in FDD's Long War Journal discussing the Trump administration's decision to redesignate Yemen's Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. As we all know, Trump reversed Biden's decision to remove them from the list after Trump added them in the final days of his first administration. But sanctioning the Houthis is not likely to do much here. There are military decisions to be made. I guess that's why we call it the Long War. Check out the latest policy brief by my colleague Jiwan Ma and star intern Maria Rio Frio on the U.S. Coast Guard's new cybersecurity requirements for all U.S. flagged vessels. With rising cyber threats from the CCP and other adversaries, this is a vital step in strengthening U.S. cybersecurity around the world. Finally, FDD's Ben Cohen has a piece in the New York Sun marking the 10-year anniversary of Argentine prosecutor Alberto Nisman's brutal murder. Nisman was investigating the Iran-backed Hezbollah perpetrated 1994 AMIA bombing in Buenos Aires. Justice has been elusive for both the victims of that attack and Nisman until now. Argentine President Javier Milei has officially acknowledged Nisman's death as a cold-blooded murder, and the wheels of justice are slowly but surely grinding on. That is going to do it for today, folks. I encourage you to check out the expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Please do read our quick takes on X at FDD and watch the videos we post on Instagram and YouTube. And as always, you can make that tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Wednesday for another episode. I'll be relinquishing my host duties for the next 3 morning briefs, but don't worry, the show will be in excellent hands. My colleagues David Daoud, Mark Montgomery, and Jonathan Conricus will be taking the wheel, and they've lined up some tremendous guests, so please do keep tuning in. I'll be back at it next week, but until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.